Hi, my name is Peter Trapp. I'm Dean of the College of Science here at the University of Utah, and I'm delighted to welcome you to this installment of Understanding the Science. Understanding the Science is a forum where we bring together scientific experts and policy experts to help address, discuss, and answer some of the most important questions facing the citizens of the state of Utah. We have an exciting panel lined up tonight. It's devoted to questions around the environmental and economic impact of wildfires and drought. And before we launch into the introduction of the panelists, I'd like to thank our partners, the Alumni Association, who are helping make tonight's event possible. And I'd also like to thank our friends at Intuitive Funding, who are helping sponsor tonight's event. The panelists today include Dr. Bill Anderegg, who's a professor in the School of Biological Sciences here at the University of Utah, Thomas Holst, who's a senior energy analyst at the Ken Gardner Policy Institute, and Dr. Mitchell Powers, who's also a professor at the University of Utah in the Department of Geography, as well as a curator of the herbarium at the Natural History Museum of Utah. Tonight's panel will be moderated by Tom Thatcher from Intuitive Funding. And let me tell you a little bit more about our distinguished panelists. So Bill Anderegg research centers around the intersection of ecosystems and climate change. He studies how drought and climate change affect forest ecosystems, including tree physiology, species interactions, carbon cycling, and biosphere-atmosphere feedbacks. In particular, he strives to understand the future of Earth's forest in the changing climate. Bill did his graduate work at Stanford University and a postdoc at Princeton before joining us here at Utah. And some of you may recognize him. He was a Frontiers of Science speaker in the series hosted by the Alumni Association earlier this year. Our next panelist is Dr. Mitchell Powers, as I mentioned, a professor in our geography department and also curator at the Natural History Museum. He's a historical biogeographer with interests in modern and past plant communities and how they respond to natural disturbances. His research is aimed at understanding how climate influences ecosystem dynamics through time. He did his graduate work at the University of Oregon and postdoctoral work at the University of Edinburgh. And finally, Thomas Holst is a senior energy analyst at the Gardner Policy Institute at the U. He's conducting research on the economic impact of Utah's energy industry and analyzing energy economic development scenarios. He earned a bachelor's in science and chemical engineering and an MBA from BYU. And prior to joining the Gardner Policy Institute, he held a variety of energy-related assignments in the US and abroad. Tonight's panel will be moderated by Tom Thatcher. He's the founder and manager of Intuitive Funding, as well as the founder of this series, Understanding the Science. He has over 25 years of business experience in the chemical industry. He has a BA in chemistry from the University of Utah and an MBA from BYU. He's been involved with many startups providing financial and mentoring support. And he was given the Distinguished Alumni Award from the University of Utah for his community service. So without further ado, I'm going to turn the discussion over to Tom, who will start engaging our panelists with a series of questions.
Thank you, Peter, and welcome everyone. It's great to have everyone here, and we're excited to have this series. This is our third series, and we now are talking about a very important topic on climate change. So we're going to start with Dr. Bill Anderegg. And Bill, can you tell us about what scientists understand about drought, fire, and the climate risks that Utah faces?
Certainly. Thank you for that question. That's a really excellent lead-in. I'll just offer kind of a few quick overview thoughts on what scientists understand about these risks. I want to show you just a brief picture, figure or two here that will help frame and set these. So I want to give you just 4 quick take-home messages that Utah is really uniquely vulnerable to climate risks, and in particular, drought and fire and heat impact the economy, businesses, and our health. Now, there are a number of things we can do about this, and planning and really science-based adaptation to these risks is quite crucial. And trying to reduce these risks by tackling climate change really can bring remarkable opportunities for Utah. So as the second driest state in the country, Utah really faces unique risks from climate change. A lot of these stem from water. Many of you probably recognize this picture of Lake Powell. And there's really a lot of economic sectors in Utah that are uniquely vulnerable to severe weather and climate change. That's agriculture, tourism and the outdoor industry, things like the ski industry, energy, natural resources. All of these are quite susceptible to disturbances and to these climate-driven risks. On the health side, there's a huge amount of research that we know that both heat has a lot of direct health impacts and wildfires through smoke. This is a nice picture from the Deseret News of Salt Lake during one of these smoke wave days. That has a huge impact on respiratory health as well, asthma, hospital admissions, children's health, and children's asthma. So this is quite well understood. How this works, how climate change really affects these is on drought and water supply, we tend to see earlier snowmelt, which means less water available in the summer. Higher temperatures, which means more water gets sucked out of soils and plants and lakes. We, of course, have growing populations and water demand, and that's another dimension here. And all of these put together means you have much less water available for people and for crops when you need it the most in the hot and dry summers. These are nice examples of Lake Powell before the drought, after a pretty severe drought. And I'm sure many of you have seen these bathtub lines or water lines around our lakes that are actually indicative of this long-term, some scientists have termed this a mega drought of about 2 decades that we are in. Turning to fires briefly, there's been a lot of really great study on the drivers of fires in the Western US. And this is one of my all-time favorite images from the National Climate Assessment. And what we know is because climate change drives these same fire weather variables, making things hotter and drier and more likely to burn, is that around half of the area burned in the Western US is due to climate change, and around half is due to other factors that I'm happy to get into in the questions more. So this is the cumulative area burned is what this graph is showing us here. And this tan slice is what we'd expect to be burning in the West in a world without human-caused climate change. And then this orange slice on top is how much climate change is adding to wildfires. Finally, this is actually some work we've been doing, trying to map the risks that climate faces, both for fire, drought, and beetles. These are kind of the triple threat that Western forests face. And what these different lines show you are these different climate futures. In the red future, we do a huge amount of carbon emissions in a high climate change scenario. And in this more lower lines, the green futures, we've tackled climate change pretty aggressively and ambitiously. And the difference between these two, this top graph shows you the area burned across the entire US over the 21st century. You can see moving from this red line here down to the green line at the bottom, we can really reduce the risk of catastrophic wildfires and droughts quite massively by trying to rein in climate change directly. So just to conclude, I think some of these climate opportunities for Utah is that reducing these risks and damages will be pretty crucial to economic prosperity and health in our state. We have these really vast existing wind and solar and low carbon resources and a pre-existing infrastructure to leverage them. I think there's a huge amount of investment potential and strong synergies with the rapidly growing tech sector in the state. And there's, I think, a real potential here to make sure that this economic prosperity is shared broadly across the state and really benefits both urban and rural areas in Utah. So that's my opening thoughts. I'm looking forward to more of these questions here.
Thank you. And let's go to the next question. And I believe this is for Thomas Holt. What sectors of the economy or government are paying attention to this? What are the solutions coming from? Where are the solutions coming from?
Okay, thank you very much for that question, Tom. My perspective this evening will be rooted firmly in policy, and my focus will be on state policy in Utah and the policy paper known as the Utah Roadmap was generated at the request of the Utah State Legislature in 2019. And this foundation document was House Concurrent Resolution 7, which called for prioritizing our understanding and use of sound science to address causes of a changing climate and support innovation and environmental stewardship. And I believe that phrase by itself captures the intent of our meeting this evening. We're all seeking to be better stewards of the environment. These 37 members of the team that worked and developed the Utah Roadmap are shown in this picture. They represent city agencies, county agencies, academia, utilities, National Weather Service, and municipal planning organizations. The recommendations that were issued were what we call mileposts, in keeping with the theme of a roadmap. I will not review these recommendations or mileposts this evening, except as the need arises in answering a question that relates directly to our topic. I would like to talk about, just close with climate basics. And this is climate basics directed at me. And but it's worth repeating to understand the context of the problem we'll review tonight. The first is it's warming. And that is, the climate is warming over time and across the globe. And the second climate basic is it's us. That is, one of the questions that I think we'll hear tonight is human activity causing increased temperatures? The graph on the lower left correlates human and natural influences with rising temperatures. So yes, it is us. We do control that. And then the last climate basic is it's serious. That is, tonight we'll be talking about drought, but we could also be talking about extreme temperatures, extreme weather, reduced farming productivity, or sea level rise. It's an important topic and we need to address it. And I'd like to say I'm very happy to be a part of this discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, Thomas. Okay, we'll go to the next question for Dr. Mitchell Power, if we'll pull that up. Question: how does studying the past inform us about the future?
Thanks, Tom. Thanks for the question. Of course, at the Natural History Museum, the past is everything to us, right? So we spend a lot of time looking into the past, and there's a few things I think that emerge from the past, but I'm not going to show you any slides, but I thought since I'm surrounded by millions of specimens, I'd show you a specimen just to start off. I have kind of a interesting specimen here. I'll just hold up to the camera. This is it's a slab from a ponderosa pine tree. This was collected a few years ago by Stan Kitchen. He works down at the Tree and Shrub Lab for the USDA. And you know what's really neat about these old trees? This is actually the oldest recorded ponderosa pine in Utah. It's over 900 years old. And these old trees tell a story. And they tell a story about 900 years of climate change, of good years and tough years for trees in Utah. But not only do they tell a story about climate change, I don't know if you can see, but there's also blackened scars in this old tree from fires. So they tell us a story both about the changing climate and the role of fire in our forest ecosystems. But I'll just come to maybe three messages about the past that I think help us think about the future. I would say first, we've learned that species and populations respond and adapt and sometimes go extinct through changing environmental conditions. And we know that perturbations occur through time and that species have had to deal with major perturbations, whether they're wildfires or droughts. Those affect our populations of species, whether it's plants or animals. And so what we learn is that some species are more vulnerable than other species. And we can start to project that forward into the future as we understand how climate will change. So that's kind of one key message. I think also we've learned an enormous amount about the Earth system's physical climate processes. So things like the growth and decay of ice sheets, and the behavior of the ocean conveyor belt system, the modes of climate that we like to talk about, like the what we call ENSO El Nino Southern Oscillation. By studying the past, we've learned how often the frequency domain, and we've also learned the geographical, what we call teleconnections, or the geographical places that are touched by these various climate modes. So we learned a tremendous amount about the climate system by looking backwards. And probably critically from that, it gives us insight into tipping points and thresholds. So when we cross a boundary of some sort that reorganizes the climate system. And so that's really important, especially when it comes to abrupt climate change. The third message I think we get from the past is really about resiliency. And we can talk about resiliency in ecological systems, but I also think we should talk a little bit about human resiliency. And so many of my colleagues here at the U in anthropology, of course, study prehistoric cultures in the West. We all have learned about the rise and fall of civilizations. We've seen how people in the past have succeeded and failed in the light of changing environmental conditions and climate. And I think there's lessons for us for how people have succeeded and failed in the past. And that's something we can put into the future. And so I think those are some of the important discoveries we've made from studying the past. And I think we can use those as we move ahead.
All right, thank you very much. Now we're going to open up all of these questions that have come from our listeners, and we're going to try to get to as many of them as we can. And so the first one is, and I'm going to get rid of my phone here. Thank you. The first one is, aren't fires nature's way of clearing and cleaning? Who would like to take that? Bill, is that one for you?
Sure, I can take a first pass. So yes, in some sense, absolutely, fires are a natural disturbance and they play a really important role in many ecosystems. Many species rely on fire for seeds to come up. They certainly play a pretty important role in structuring how forests look and as this question kind of articulates, maybe cleaning out or clearing out some of the biomass. So the issue here why we're thinking about fires is not that they aren't natural and that they aren't a part of ecosystems. It's that climate change is supercharging them and making them far worse and far more severe than they have been, at least in the past several thousand years. And so the challenge here is that we're seeing longer fire seasons, we're seeing more severe fires, and we're seeing really kind of more intense and more area burning than there used to be. And of course, there are several causes of this. It's not only climate change, as I showed in that initial graph. Certainly, there are legacies of historical land management and fire suppression. And there are ways we can try to be proactive about management to tackle that and to reduce some of the fire risks. But we have to be clear, climate change is absolutely a big driver in the system and does matter for the future of wildfires. So it's not kind of an either or, either fires are good or bad. They certainly do plenty of positive things, but we are supercharging them.
Okay, any other of the panelists want to weigh in on that question?
Yeah, I'll just pick up. One of the questions I often get about fire is, the good or bad question. And I really want to emphasize the positive role of fire, because I think that gets lost in the kind of catastrophic news headlines we get with fire. And so every fire has this incredible ability of releasing nutrients in both terrestrial and aquatic systems. It opens canopy gaps in vegetation and increases biodiversity. It can even reset the trajectory of vegetation communities from herb shrublands to more canopy dominance. And I think fires, they really provide dynamic habitats for many species. And so this what we often call mosaic for biodiversity. And so the positive role of fire is a critical concern to maintain. But like Bill is suggesting, we have to really address this balance, right?
So in some ways, gentlemen, you're saying fires are okay. Is that right, Bill?
So fires are not inherently good or bad, and we need clearly some amount of fire on the landscape. As we've seen in the 20th century, if you try to remove all fire from the landscape, like we did through fire suppression in many parts of the West, it doesn't go well. It's not a great thing for ecosystems or people. The problem is, it's a little bit like saying, is iron a good thing or a bad thing, right? We do need iron as an essential mineral for human health, but we don't want to go around eating buckets of nails. That is clearly too much iron to be healthy for anyone. And what we're really struggling with in the West right now is we have way too much fire that's driven by climate change. So we certainly need a mosaic of some fire, and particularly the natural sort of what we think of as the natural fire regimes maybe that existed before at least European settlement. And those are kind of a lot of frequent but low severity fires in many systems that clear out the underbrush and kind of help many species. And these high severity fires are not really what we want for people or ecosystems in most cases.
All right, thank you, Thomas. Do you want to weigh in at all on this? You're muted, Tom.
No, I'll defer to my colleagues on that.
Okay, very good. Let's go to the next question then. How can increased population of the state, recreation use, and water use be controlled, regulated to help prevent human-caused fires? Mitchell or Bill, what do you say on that?
Well, part of the concern, I guess, is to first look at what are the causes of human ignitions, right? So where are we adding fire? As Bill suggests, we have too much fire. So where are we adding it? And we know we're not a lightning limited planet. There's something, I think, I forget the stats, like 8 million lightning strikes a day occur on the planet. So ignition from lightning is not limited, but we've then added human ignition. And human ignition often falls into one category, but I think it can be broken into many categories. And so, I think part of to answer this question and preventing human-caused fires is to look at what's the root of the human-caused fires, which is the ignition source. And the ignition source can be from, several things. It's often, pointed towards campfires and camping in the wilderness areas and campfires that just aren't put out properly. But we've all seen news where, chains dragging on trailers on highways can throw sparks. We know that cars parked on dry grass can cause fire. So there's not great research right now on ignition attribution by humans. And I think part of understanding how to prevent it is to begin to educate more and really explore where all of these ignitions coming from that are adding to our abundance of fire.
So Bill, how do we control?
Yeah, so I think as Mitch very nicely articulated, we can definitely think about education and sort of campaigns to help people minimize these sparks and these ignition sources. We have to think about also that a spark alone does not cause a fire. You have to have sufficient fuel and dry enough fuel. And that's where a lot of the climate connections come in. But then you also have to have enough biomass of things to burn. And if we want to avoid really catastrophic fires that threaten human livelihoods, towns, houses, structures, here I think there's a strong role for proactive planning, both in managing some of our forests to reduce fire risk and in thinking about our urban wildland interface and how do we have things like defensible space or trying to keep people out of harm's way in high fire zones. We have to think about these dimensions of planning, of city and land management and land planning to try to, I think really reduce the risks and damages of people and property getting in harm's way from fire. So the spark is definitely an important piece, but I think for resiliency to fire, it's only the start of what we need to be thinking about.
But it sounds like it's pretty hard to prevent. Is that correct?
Yeah, certainly education does help. The vast majority of fires that start tend to be human caused, but the vast majority of acres that burn are lightning caused because lightning caused fires tend to get out of control and burn bigger. So we're never going to get rid of the lightning caused fires. Those are beyond our control.
Okay, Thomas, do you have any comment?
Yeah, the one thing I would contribute is the state of Utah's demographic team is embedded in the Gardner Policy Institute. And when the census numbers were released, I believe 10 days ago, confirmed that Utah is the fastest growing state in the United States. What that means is we are attracting people. Over the COVID period, we've seen the rise of what we call Zoom communities, people who have found that they can telework just as well from a beautiful spot located in Utah as they can from in a densely populated area on the east or the west coast.
Okay, let's move on. Next question. Much of the Wasatch back is laden with fur, and several years of drought have stressed them to the point where many have died. We're talking about the fur. Can you talk about the cause, ways to prevent it, and the best way to remove the dead trees? Mitchell, what do you think?
Yeah, I'll take a stab. So I guess it takes me to the fir that we're talking about, which I assume is probably subalpine fir, sometimes called corkbark fir. It's a mid to high elevation fir. So just a few characters about this particular species or conditions it likes to thrive in. It really loves the snowpack zone, so that's why you find it at higher elevation. It's one of these species that really prefers wet soil moisture, so it needs that fairly constant soil moisture. It's pretty shade intolerant, and maybe importantly with fire, it has no evidence of fire adaptation. In fact, it's thin bark and it's what we call ladder fuel. So these are all the lower branches on the fir. So it's heavily laden with ladder fuels. And this combination of lots of ladder fuels and thin bark makes it incredibly vulnerable to fire. And maybe just an example on bark thickness. And so if you have a fire moving through a forest at about 500 degrees Celsius, a bark thickness of about 1/2 centimeter, a tree can survive that fire for 1 minute. If you increase the bark thickness by 2 more centimeters, so if you go to 2.5 centimeters, that tree can survive for about 20 minutes. And so as you move up in elevation, what you discover in Utah's forests is that bark thickness becomes thinner, which is really the protective covering around the cambium, the kind of life of the tree underneath that bark. It's because the high elevations have long fire return intervals. So part of the story with the fir is that it's incredibly vulnerable to a changing fire regime as fires start to move into these higher elevations at a higher frequency. And ways to prevent it. As soil moisture dries out, as our summers become warmer and longer, and as our snowpack melts out earlier, and those spring soils dry more rapidly, these furs, these subalpine furs, are vulnerable. And we can look at some projections. There's been some really neat work done up in Oregon State and University of Oregon by Pat Martline and Sarah Schaefer, and they've modeled forward individual species and how ranges might collapse or expand under a 2 times CO2 scenario. And when I've looked at fur for the Wasatch, it looks like fur's in trouble. But actually, if you look over in the Uintas, subalpine fur might not be eradicated from the Uintas in these future climate scenarios. Of course, these are just scenarios, but there is some vulnerability of fur. And then, the removing part, it's kind of an individual's decision whether you want to remove biomass from a landscape if it's your personal property. My opinion on that is to keep the biomass there. Of course, dead trees become habitat for lots of species. Birds and arthropods, insects love dead trees. But if it's really an aesthetic and you want to remove the tree, my suggestion would be mulch it in place and put that biomass back in the soil. But maybe Bill can comment some more on this particular species.
Yeah, and Bill, when you're commenting, what is the best way to remove the dead trees?
Yeah, these are really great questions. It is a little bit a matter of context of how many do you have, how broad of area are we talking, how easy is it to access? Is this a couple chainsaw sort of thing, or you need a actual timber company to come in? I like Mitch's suggestion a lot of trying to keep the biomass there. If there's, of course, many trees, you really are in the scenario where probably you have to have, this is the sort of salvage logging operations. The research on this is that it's not always clear, at least if for huge swaths of the landscape, if it makes a ton of sense to salvage log. That there's certainly some areas that do make sense both economically and can have some ecological benefits, but there are often some trade-offs there in that if you can keep the dead trees on the landscape, it adds a lot of habitat for many species. And if you do the salvage logging kind of poorly, you can have these consequences of erosion and things like that can harm natural regeneration and these forests recovering. Just very briefly on the first part, this pretty severe drought that started in 2018, and of course we're looking at a fairly low snowpack this year and likely to continue into this severe drought, has been very harmful for many tree species in Utah. And in the case of fir, like many of our species, it really seems to be a 1-2 punch between drought and some biotic agents that will come in and kind of attack stressed and dying trees. And that seems to be what pushes many of these conifers over the edge. There's not a lot you can do to prevent it. Occasionally you can spray trees to try to keep the bugs from coming in, but that's certainly a small scale thing where you could protect a few areas around houses, but you're not going to protect huge areas of the Wasatch Mountains.
All right, thank you, Bill. Thomas, anything you want to comment on this?
No, I think Mitchell and Bill covered it. Thank you.
Okay, great. Let's move to the next question. What do we know about how drought and fire impact not just water quantity, but water quality? If we have seen negative changes to water quality, what can we do to address those problems? Bill, why don't you start this one first?
Sure. Yeah, this is a really great question. So there is a lot of research, particularly on fire and the effects on water. And in many cases, especially if you have pretty severe fires like we've had in parts of the West, there are really big impacts on water quality, that you tend to see huge amounts of leaching nutrients into the water. It often triggers erosion and mudslides that can happen weeks or months later. And that, of course, has enormous impacts for sediments and particulate in water that go downstream. On On the drought side, there's been a little bit of work, and in particular, when the forests die off, you actually do see water quality decline. So there's a really fantastic study across Colorado that found in watersheds where huge amounts of trees died from drought and beetles, that water quality went down fairly substantially. Now, we can do a number of things about this, ranging from sort of more expensive to even more expensive. And I guess the initial thing is to really try to reduce some of the erosion and losses of soil, particularly after fire. And that has to do a lot with trying to plant out stabilizing vegetation, maybe trying to plant tree seedlings to grow back in these forests in these areas, and really prevent all of these sediments and sort of harmful concentrations of nutrients from hitting streams and our rivers. Further down the road, if it's a continual big problem, we may ultimately have to have more water treatment plants. That's more of a technological fix that is even probably more expensive than the ecosystem restoration approaches of trying to minimize the losses of soil.
Mitchell, what do you think?
Yeah, great points, Bill. I guess I just add, this idea of high intensity rainfall events that may mobilize sediments and organic matter and nutrients and bring those nutrients down into our reservoirs. We often think of that in the time immediately after a fire, but the U.S. Geological Survey has really led the research on a lot of this fire sediment challenge that we have ahead of us. And we really need to be monitoring years out after fires occur in watersheds and looking at that movement of these nutrients and dissolved organic matter and all of this material that's moving down into our reservoirs. And there's some really impressive estimates out there about how much our reservoirs will fill with this sediment slurry over the next several decades. And so it's a concern because not only do you lose space in the reservoirs, but you also contaminate the water quality that we all depend on. And maybe not such a radical idea is to let beavers come back into our ecosystems, because beavers, we know beavers are what we call ecosystem engineers, but beavers effectively build check dams. And when you have check dams in drainages, what those do is create natural sediment traps. And not only that, they provide this incredible wildlife habitat for, just like the dead tree does on a landscape, a beaver pond is used by hundreds of species, maybe thousands in some cases. So, there are natural fixes. Of course, it gets into some politicization of, whether beavers can be on the landscape. And of course, beavers like to eat trees too. So, there's some discussion maybe to be had around that. But, I think having our eye on the sediment challenge, I think is a really important problem as we move forward and fire becomes more abundant in our mountains around us.
Thank you. Thomas, anything you want to add?
Yeah, I just add a comment about the communities that are confronting and are worried about these issues. During our work on the Utah roadmap, our team conducted focus group discussions along the Wasatch Front, as well as in communities down south in Richfield and in Price. And along the Wasatch Front, the main concern was air quality due to inversions that prevented canyon breezes from moving out stale, stagnant air. By contrast, off the Wasatch Front, focus was on water quantity.
Yeah, and just from a layman here, when we think about drought, we just think, oh, okay, we just don't have as much water. But we've got to realize that when we have a drought, we've got some other problems as well. So this is a very good question. I appreciate the listener bringing it up. Okay, let's move on. Next question is, how does drought affect Utah's economy? Should businesses be worried? Bill, I think we should, right?
Drought has a pretty large impact on us here in Utah and the economy, and it varies certainly by sector and what different sectors need. I think that certainly it's going to affect tourism and the places like the ski industry when you don't have snow and water in the winter. One of the biggest things that I always emphasize when I'm talking about water in Utah is that agriculture is really one of the biggest sectors that gets the squeeze here, because water problems are agriculture problems. Around 80% of our water in Utah goes to agriculture, and in many cases to pretty high water using crops like alfalfa. And so as we're looking at a severe drought this year, and likely more frequent of these years in the future, we need to be thinking about how can we start to adapt and respond to these stresses. So certainly there are a number of different adaptation options we can think about, but water's looking relatively more and more scarce in Utah, like much of the Western US.
Thomas, should we be worried? Should we be worried?
Yes, let me answer the second question first. Should Utah businesses be worried? And I would say no one should ever minimize the consequences of drought. If a state were highly dependent on agriculture, drought conditions would be disastrous. That said, Utah has a highly diversified economy. Using the Hockman Index scores, which measure economic diversity, Utah has the most diverse economy in the USA. Counties surrounding Salt Lake have diverse economies. Counties such as Duchesne, Emery, and Uinta are less diverse, being heavily dependent on extractive industries. And then let me tackle the next question. How does drought affect Utah's economy? And I'd like to raise the issue of agricultural sustainability. Utah's population growth, land prices, market prices for agricultural products continue to pressure conversion of farmland to residential and commercial development. And as Bill pointed out, agriculture diverts approximately 80% of developed water, but it returns more than half back to the ecosystem. In the nation's second most arid state, Utah continues to pressure conversion of agricultural water to municipal and industrial uses. And to be clear, the 2020 census, as I mentioned, showed that Utah's the fastest growing state, and with that influx of people, those economic pressures to convert farmland into residential and commercial usage will continue.
Mitchell, just really quickly, so we can move on to the next question. Do you want to?
Yeah, I think they've covered it really well. No,
Okay, let's move on then. What plans are in place to address water security in view of Utah's forecasted population growth, and what options are there? Mitchell, what do you think?
This gets a bit out of my expertise, but I'll just throw a couple ideas out, and Bill and Tom can take those or leave them. But it seems to me that one of our biggest concerns in Utah and overwater usage, or maybe unwise water usage, is overwatering in the urban centers, overwatering lawns, and outdoor watering of both residential and businesses. And I forget the numbers on that, but it's not a big shift to reel in some of the wasteful water use that we do in both commercial and kind of residential zones. And so I think there's an opportunity there to really push some behavioral changes in how we interact with water and how we value water. And I think Tom raised that a few moments ago, and how important water is, that we should never take anything for granted with our water conditions here. So, maybe I'll just end by, a simple solution, something like putting a soil moisture probe in your lawn that activates your sprinkler. So you're not watering your lawn at 2 o'clock in the afternoon. You're watering in the middle of the night when your soil moisture comes down and your lawn actually needs the water. So anyways, there may be some really easy, low-hanging solutions that can curtail some of the water demands and water security concerns we have.
Thomas, what's your thoughts?
Yeah, Tom, I believe the person submitting the question may have been referring to the proposed Lake Powell pipeline, a 140-mile-long pipeline that would divert water from the Colorado River and use it in Washington County. Representatives from Arizona, California, Colorado, Nevada, New Mexico, and Wyoming have indicated that they would litigate if that project is approved by federal authorities. And while these 6 states haven't rejected the project out of hand, I believe that the approval process will be lengthy.
Bill, any further comments?
I'll pass this time. I think those are really great thoughts.
Okay, all right. Let's move on. How sure are we that global warming is the cause of the increase in wildfires? Is it really more than a natural assumption? I think this is an excellent question. Who wants to jump in first on this?
I can take a
Bill
first.
does. Okay,
Yeah.
Go ahead, Bill.
Yeah, I mean, I get this question quite a lot, and there has been a huge amount of research, particularly in the last 10 to 15 years on this. And it's incredibly clear that global warming is one important cause of the increase in wildfires. Like many things in our world, you can have multiple drivers in a change that's happening. And so there are effects of land management, fire suppression, and some of the things we've done in the past in forests. But what we know, so some of the many reasons that we know that global warming is affecting fires, you can see these incredibly strong relationships, correlations between hot and dry years and fire, the amount of area that burns, the number of fires, and the size of fires. And the earlier you have snow melt, the bigger fires you have. And of course, a heating up climate gives us less snow and earlier snow melt. And then the hotter and drier the air is, the more fires you have. And then of course, the drier the fuel is, the more fires you have. So we understand the physics really, really well of this. And the same patterns show up over huge swaths of space and time. So we can track fires really, really well from satellites. And that figure I showed in my initial talk, that about half of the area burned in the Western US is due to global warming. That comes from about a 35-year record of satellites, of NASA satellites that have looked down at the US, and they really capture fires at about a 30-yard resolution. So they can see incredibly detailed fires and track how many they are and how much area they're burning. What this incredible study did to arrive at this is it looked at how many fires would we expect in a world without global warming, and how many do we see in the current world, in the modern world, with global warming. And the difference between those two tells us how much global warming or climate change is really driving this trend. And it's a big factor. It's about half. So that's my summary of a lot of this research. It's really cool and really important research. And we've been doing some modeling of fires on our own too. And you can really explain a huge amount of where and when fires occur with temperature alone. So that's one of these big drivers in the system.
Thomas, what's your opinion?
Yeah, I'll fall back on the 3 climate basics that I started out with. 1, it's warming. 2, it's us. And 3, it's serious. And I believe that I believe in science, first of all. And 18 scientific associations have issued a statement, and I'll just, it's one sentence. It says, observations make it clear that climate change is occurring, and scientific research demonstrates that greenhouse gases emitted by human activities are the primary driver. And so I believe that, as my favorite comic strip character Pogo once said, we've met the enemy and he is us.
So Mitchell, I've got a question for you on this then. We have to remove the debate, correct? We've got a climate change problem. Is that safe enough to say from a scientist's point of view, without creating all this different argument or debate, we have a climate problem? Is that correct?
Yeah, Tom, it is correct. And it's really interesting because here at the Natural History Museum, I get a chance to interface with the public, probably more than a lot of my colleagues at the University of Utah. And the question I get most often is, it starts with, which side of the fence are you on? And my answer, which is a little cheeky, is that the fence burnt down, because there is no more fence. It's been consumed in the last fire. And so, we do have to move on. We have to start thinking about mitigation and adaptation. And those are now where our energy and discussion should be focused, more so than trying to convince the public that whether or not there's this global warming phenomena happening. So it's, I think for a scientist, it's easy to get frustrated, but at the same time, I love my patrons that come to the museum. I just love to talk to people, and I want to meet them on their own terms. And so I think what's really important, and a lesson for me is what do Utahns care about? What is really important to them? Is it the ability to go camping in the Uinta Mountains in the summer? Find where people are before you get into any kind of debate, and help them work through this logic, because there's no question, dry forests, dry, hot, windy weather, these critical factors that Bill talked about, the early snow melt, the high summer temperatures, longer fire seasons, expanded areas and high elevation that are now, more vulnerable for this ever widening kind of window for fires to happen. And it's really interesting. If you talk to any of the wildland firefighters, it used to be a summer job. And so you'd go and you'd check out of school at the end of the semester, and you'd work fires for the summer, and you'd come back to school in late August, September. And now they have to fight fires till November. And so you don't have to look very far for the evidence. But I just want to circle back. I think it's really important that we meet people with the things they care about and try to move past this debate.
So just to pause a minute before we go to the next question. Isn't one of the problems, though, about this climate change is, first of all, lack of information? Because I myself have been really educated tonight. I went, wow, I'm going to put a little more thought into this, because this hasn't been really on my radar. And the fact that it's so slow developing. I mean, it's not something that's just, in the next week, we're going to be in this major crisis. So what can we do to try to create some urgency? Because kind of the feeling I'm getting is that there's not a lot of urgency. Now, am I missing this, or go ahead, weigh in on that. Bill, go ahead.
Yeah, it's a really great observation. I think many scientists are, given how long that we've known about these risks, and that this clear effect of humans on climate has really been well, the physics has been understood for 120 years since Arrhenius in the 1890s, but actually the evidence has become overwhelming in about the 1990s. So we've had about 30 years to start tackling climate change seriously. And by and large, at least in the US, we haven't done a lot of that. I think that fires and drought are really clear examples of this happening in our backyards and happening almost every single summer. You know, I think these are really clear signals, and they're flashing warning lights. They're telling us, hey, the system is changing, and it's changing rapidly, and it's going to impact all of our health and our economy. And so it's really a question of, are we going to be proactive? Are we going to be smart and try to tackle this strategically? Or are we going to be reactive and respond and really increase human suffering that way? And so I think I still remain optimistic that we can certainly take a lot of steps and improve quite a bit in the coming couple of years. I think we have a really strong window in the 2020s to kind of flatten the climate curve, so to speak, to really try to tackle this problem and make ourselves more resilient and more prosperous in the process. But that window is not going to last forever. So I think we've got to really try to seize the urgency that folks see when the fires burn each summer.
Tom, maybe I'll just add one observation, which is related to 1988, when Yellowstone National Park saw something like 600,000 hectares burn. And I think that the nation reacted in horror. That, you know, one of its crown jewel national parks was you know, in many of the headlines, ruined. But it was an opportunity because of paradigm shift. And if you talk to anyone who visits Yellowstone National Park today, they're in awe of the recovery since 1988. And so it's those kinds of opportunities that I think can really help us create this sense of urgency. You know, and maybe, you know, I don't want to say there'll be another Yellowstone, but I think seizing on those opportunities to shift public consciousness and get people to really get on board with some of the change we need to make happen.
So Thomas, me just as a normal citizen worried about job and family, et cetera, how do you get me excited about this? How do you get the citizen to say, well, we've got to really get serious about this, right? Because it seems to me that this is going to take a big unified effort of people being very conservative with water and being very mindful of things, because it's not so immediate. Can you weigh in a little bit on that?
Sure, thank you. I believe that my experience has been that when people talk about air quality and then are asked to talk about climate change, they feel more passionate about air quality because the chances are higher that it affects someone within their immediate family or someone that they know. My experience has been air quality drives the discussion, and it is, I'm not sure how to push those people over the finish line to recognize that climate change is an issue that needs to be confronted as urgently as air quality.
Okay, well, let's move on. Next question. What are your thoughts about fuel reduction for Utah? For example, prescribed burning is recognized as an effective way to reduce fuels and the likelihood of severe wildfires, but it has drawbacks. In other words, smoke and public disapproval in some cases. Bill, what are your thoughts?
This is a really interesting question in an interesting area. I think actually the question asker really hits some of the key pluses and minuses of prescribed burning as a management technique and a way to try to increase our resilience to fire and our landscape's resilience to fire. I think in many systems, especially systems that had these very frequent low intensity fires that came through the understory and removed fuels, things like ponderosa pine systems, for example, it is a very valuable management tool, and it would be, I think, a tool we'd be wise to use more often. In many cases, there are often budget constraints to this, that a lot of our forest management funds get spent fighting fires every year, which is, again, this reactive way rather than being proactive at managing our landscapes. And there are these, some of these challenges and drawbacks, the smoke, public disapproval. There have been some prescribed fires that have gotten out of control. And so there are some downsides, but I think it's definitely a really powerful tool that we, in some ecosystems, really ought to be deploying quite a bit more. It would certainly strengthen the long-term resilience of those forests. Mitch, you probably want to add thoughts on that.
I think you nailed it, Bill. It's a really complex issue. And, I think fire is a tool, and I like to think of, the elevational gradients that we have here in Utah, where, these low to mid elevations, they need fire. The plants that live down here, they are evolved with fire. I mean, you take our Gamble oak woodlands that we have all around the University of Utah. Gamble oak is completely fire adapted. It has this giant root ball called a lignotuber, and this is just this big starchy thing that looks kind of like an oversized potato. And as soon as you burn that Gamble oak, it resprouts within days and grows a new tree. And so these species have learned to thrive in a fire environment. So if you take that out of your toolkit, you have species that have adapted to fire that are going to have real problems. And that doesn't even include like the cone serotiny species, like lodgepole, which requires fire to open its cone and release its seeds. And so there is a mixed toolkit. There's a tremendously expensive mechanical treatment, right, which is chainsaws and wood chippers and changing the vertical biomass to horizontal biomass. And that's another fantastic approach, but it's expensive, and like Bill said, it's the kind of proactive versus reactive. We are so far down this path of what we call a fire deficit, and the kind of overloading of fuels, especially in these low to mid elevations, that it's a tremendous cost now to try to manage that overgrowth of vegetation. There's also biological methods. That some national parks are starting to use goats to go in and do fuel reduction. There is a toolkit, but I think Bill really hit it on the spot when it's about budgets and about trying to shift to preparing for what's coming versus spending all your money on putting out what's already happened.
Okay, all right, let's move on. Next question. Now, panel, what I want to do is we've got about 25 minutes to go, and I want to try to get as many of these last questions as we can. So whoever wants to answer the question, just unmute your mic and I'll call on you first. And then if another person in our panel wants to answer the question as well, then unmute your mic and I'll call on you next. And we'll see how many we can get through with this last bit of time that we have. All right, so at a time when demand for camping and RV adventure has been greater, what can we do to save our forests from human-started fires? Who wants to start? Nobody's unmuting, so do I call on somebody? Bill, go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, I think we can tackle this one fairly briefly because there's a decent overlap with some of the questions and issues we've been talking about. I think that, so there's ways to reduce human ignition sources, and a lot of that revolves around education. And The vast majority of area that burns is actually from lightning. And so in thinking about trying to prevent fires and how much area burns, we're really talking about mitigating climate change, and we're talking about proactive fire management to reduce fuels. So that's some of these things like prescribed burning, selective logging, trying to create defensible spaces and good planning for communities. So this is kind of the wide range of toolkits in terms of reducing fire risk generally.
Okay, great. Let's move on. Next question. What grand public works on a nationwide scale could help bring more water to the West? Who wants to unmute and answer first? Thomas, go ahead.
Yeah. Tom, I think this might have been the Lake Powell pipeline, and that's the only one that I'm aware of that would bring more water by diverting from the Colorado River and supporting projected growth within St. George. But I'll defer to Bill and Mitch if there are other public works in progress.
I'll just chime in. You know, I don't know if there's specific public works happening in Utah, but I think California is an interesting place to look for some solutions. You know, Bill's probably aware of the Stanford Water Project, and there's been some great kind of think tank output from some of their work, and you know, things like reversing groundwater depletion, trying to get more kind of reservoir water and less groundwater into cities, I think is a good one. There's issues around the water market, and that it generally, like in California, it discourages conservation and water trading. And I think, you know, rewarding sustainable agricultural practices, you know, and so I think those three areas are rooms for kind of large scale programs that can help the water budgets that we are going to see continue to deplete.
Okay, great. Bill, go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, I think some of the challenge to wrap our head around here is in the West, we're not going to get more water in the future. We're going to get less water in the future. That's a given, and there's really no feasible infrastructure to pipe water from the east to the west that, you know, that far. It's massively expensive just to pipe it small distances. And so the question really becomes, how can we more efficiently use the water we have in a way that helps us be prosperous and be healthy and continue our different economic activities? And that's where a lot of this hinges around conservation, around planning, and really trying to be smart about the water we have. And we do currently have enough water, but we're looking at a water crunch, and we need to be smart about the water that we do have.
Okay, great. Let's go to the next question. What areas in the U.S. most endangered by drought and severe weather? What areas in the U.S. least endangered by drought and severe weather? Bill.
Yeah, we actually just really wrapped up a study about this, in particular on drought, fire, and insects. And generally, the southwestern US is far and away the most endangered by drought. That the Four Corners states plus, you know, parts of California and Texas and into Nevada, that's really ground zero for drought vulnerability here in the US. And so Utah's, of course, smack in the middle of this. Severe weather is a little bit different depending on, you know, you think of severe weather as tornadoes, hurricanes, windstorms, those all have kind of different spatial patterns. But for drought, the pattern is very, very clear. Least endangered by drought, you know, generally the further north you go, and in particular in the northeastern US, so as you get into the Great Lakes and also New England, those swaths, climate models suggest those areas are likely to have very minimal precipitation change or even maybe slightly wetter times. So those are the areas that I think scientists are currently least concerned about severe drought stress.
Okay, great. Let's move on. Next question. Can you address the role of small modular reactors in getting us to zero carbon? What does the future look like for Utah? Thomas, you're unmuted. Go ahead.
Sure. The Utah Association of Municipal Power Systems, better known as UAMPS, is working with the Idaho National Laboratory on a carbon-free power project using NuScale modular nuclear technology. The Idaho National Lab is the premier nuclear lab in the United States. This nuclear power plant is set to dispatch electricity in 2029, and the facility is located within the service area of 4 utilities: the Western Area Power Administration, Bonneville Power, Idaho Power, and then Pacific Core. UAMPS is contracted to purchase 100 megawatts for a minimum of 40 years and will be the operator of the power plant. And I understand UAMPS has 23 communities that are currently subscribed to receive service from this nuclear power plant. The attraction to this is there will be utilities that are now dispatching carbon-free electricity in a wide area.
So Thomas, is nuclear energy a route we got to go?
I understand that nuclear has a checkered history in the state of Utah. I would say the past resistance to nuclear has been nuclear plants on the East Coast that have brought their spent waste and store it in Dugway or another area. The reason that this particular power plant is different is that the spent nuclear waste will be on site. It will be in Idaho. It will not travel to Utah, and so it will remain in place. That is one obstacle that traditionally has been a barrier to adoption of nuclear within Utah.
Okay, next question. Can you explain water rights in the Colorado River Basin and how to protect Utah's water and forest? Bill?
Yeah, that's a great question. It's a little far out of my realm of expertise on the water rights side, so I'll leave that for if others want to tackle. I can certainly speak to the second half of this question, which is that a lot of protecting water involves using it more smartly and making sure that we're conserving water when and where we can, and really trying to use water effectively to accomplish what we want it to do. Utah's forests, there's really this triple threat that Utah's forests face. There's fires, which we've talked a lot about, droughts, and then there's insects or pests and pathogens. And a lot of the way to protect Utah's forests is to reduce the speed and severity of climate change. And then there are more local and regional actions that we can do to try to increase resilience and decrease vulnerability. So that's things like prescribed burning on the fire side. On the insect side, a lot of it has to do with trying to get more of a mosaic landscape where you don't have dominance by a single species that is packed and really too densely forested. Those are really the conditions upon which climate change tends to then drive major insect outbreaks. So we can increase resilience of Utah's forests by really coming up with a diversely structured landscape and multiple species, rather than kind of a monodominant pine forest that tends to be vulnerable to insects.
Thomas, what about the water rights?
I will defer to Mitch and Bill on this one. Thank you.
Okay.
We really need a water lawyer here, I think.
Yeah.
I don't know what Mitch, if you have
Oh,
thought.
okay, Mitchell, this is not your expertise either?
No, but it just maybe 2 comments. I think there's something like 40 million people that use the Colorado River as a resource. So thinking about the Colorado River Basin, which is around like, it's less than 60% of its average snowpack right now. And maybe one other piece is, if you look at where Lake Mead is, which is kind of a down basin catchment, I think the latest number was it's 39 or 40% full. And if Lake Mead drops another 4 or 5 feet, I think the Bureau of Reclamation, which expects to see this happen in June this year, is going to then trigger some water conservation steps, which it's never triggered before. And so this is kind of a time to pay attention, because what will happen is, and I don't know the details of the legality, but in 2022, when these take effect, downriver states, Arizona, Nevada, they're going to see the consequences of less water availability. And that doesn't even bring into the conversation tribes on the river basin. And, tribes they've lacked a consistent access to clean and plentiful water for decades. And so they're feeling the effects of this drought too. So there's a lot of complexity there.
Okay, next question. Fires can disperse nutrients and seeds in some species of plants. Are there any models that might predict how the landscape vegetation might change with increased drought and wildfires? Bill? And you got to admit, Bill, we're getting some great questions tonight, aren't we?
We are. It's always a great audience when you're, when you've got a lot of both super interesting, but also some stumpers in there. This one's fascinating. So there definitely are models that can predict how vegetation might change. And these are actually things that my research group is working with pretty actively. And a number of folks at the U are working on this. And they tend to fall into two broad families. We have these kind of large, what are called statistical models that are looking at correlations of where plants exist with certain drought or fire regimes. And then we have what are often called more mechanistic models, which are really using basics of plant physiology and forest ecology to try to predict how trees grow and die in different fire regimes and different climates. Generally speaking, we expect that most species are going to be wanting to shift uphill because that's the biggest temperature and water drivers, that as the climate heats up and water gets more limiting, species are going to move to where it's cooler and wetter, uphill and towards north-facing slopes. Fires are more complicated. Fires are kind of like a reset button on the vegetation, and what comes up after is not always clear. It depends on the seed bank. It depends on the severity of the fire. We do know that in many cases, some type of forest will come back after a fire if the fire is not too severe and doesn't destroy everything in the seed bank. One of the fascinating developments that we've seen in the past couple years, though, is that it matters where the fire strikes. And a really severe fire at a low elevation site, those areas seem to be not actually coming back as forests, that those seem to be the cases where fire is actually shifting vegetation and they're not recovering as forests, largely due to this climate change signal that those areas are just too hot and dry to sustain trees these days.
Okay. Mitchell, do you want to weigh in a little bit, or?
Yeah, this is really Bill's wheelhouse. But just, a few things from my reading of some of the outputs from the models is there are going to be profound changes in successional dynamics. So which species come in and replace burnt areas, changes in species composition. So who's there? And think about the loss of landscape carbon. And so these are huge carbon reserves out there. And so these models are teaching us really incredible things about some of the challenges that lie ahead. And so they're incredibly important tools.
Okay, next question.
Tom, I just love to throw one.
Go ahead, Bill.
Yeah, just one brief note actually is that we are developing these really high resolution maps of fire and drought and insect risk for the US. We're trying to come up with maps of risk at a 4-kilometer resolution. And this should be rolling out in a couple of months, really, hopefully the next 3 to 6 months. So I encourage you, if you're interested, to check this out. We want to make all of this data completely, freely, and publicly available, and to develop really nice and easy tools to use if you're curious, what does future fire risk or future drought risk look like in your favorite area?
Okay, great. Let's go to the next question. We want to try to get as many as possible here. What are some tactical things we can do in our day-to-day life to help us get out of the drought? What about Utah state policies? Thomas, what can we do?
Sure. I would, with your permission, Tom, I'd like to change drought and replace it with climate change. And
Okay.
I'd like to say air quality became better after COVID-19 led to reduced automobile traffic on I-15. And so we had decreases in nitrous oxides, sulfur oxides, particulate matter. What happens, and I think, what habits are we likely to continue from this COVID-19 era to post-COVID? And I think the answers are more telework, that is less commuting, bicycling is increased, and hiking is increased. And how quickly did our perceptions of climate change or air quality appear during COVID? And I'll just, air quality improvement associated with a 40% reduction in I-15 traffic was immediate. And I'll just illustrate with a quick personal example. My wife and I take our morning constitutional on Fridays and hike up behind Ensign Peak to get a full view of Salt Lake Valley. Visibility to Point of the Mountain happened very, very quickly within the COVID era. My good friend Logan Mitchell of the Department of Atmospheric Sciences summed up his monitoring of air quality in this way. He said, "The results give me a lot of optimism about the future. It shows that as we recover from the pandemic, if we invest in clean energy and electric vehicles, it's really possible to clean up the air."
So what about the Utah state policies, Tom?
Sure. In the One Utah roadmap of Governor Cox, he has a section titled Sustainable Growth Promotion, and the subtitle is Taking Meaningful Long-Term Action to Combat Poor Air Quality and Climate Change. And this contains a set of actions that are directed at the state, in particular, converting the state vehicle fleet to zero or low emission vehicles, investing in EV charging stations, and essentially what he was saying is Utah State and the employees of Utah State will lead by example.
Okay, let's go to the next question. What is the technology industry doing to solve these issues? Thomas, I think that's still your area.
Sure. Let me talk to you about one of the third milepost in the Utah roadmap, and that is create a premier air quality changing climate solutions lab. And let me just answer briefly by saying at the Point of the Mountain, the footprint of the Utah State Prison will be vacated in mid next year as it moves out to the northwest quadrant. And that area, at least part of it, will contain what we call an innovation district. And that is part of these solutions that we're looking for to improve air quality and to combat climate change. So I would say stay tuned. The state, University of Utah is dedicated to developing those technologies.
Okay, let's go to the next question. What changes in forestry and land management are being taken to prepare for the worst droughts and wildfires in the coming years? And we have 5 minutes left, panel, so be very quick on this because I want to leave some time for the Dean, Peter Trappa, to give his final thoughts. So whoever wants to answer this last question, be pretty quick, please.
I'll just briefly throw out that, I think a lot of land management agencies are very keyed into these upcoming threats and are paying attention to it and are developing a lot of management plans to try to be proactive about preparing for fire and drought. And really a lot of the limits come down to being able to carry out those management plans and having the resources and the people to do so.
All right, thank you very much. First of all, I want to thank all of you panelists. Thank you so much for taking your time out tonight. I want to thank all the people that are listening tonight that are concerned about our climate, concerned about where we live and all of the factors that affect that. I think that we got a couple of key points. Number one, that climate change is a problem. Let's quit arguing about it. It's a problem. We need to do something about it. And number two, what can we do to do our part and to help each other out? I know I've got my family members sometimes that are after me because I use too much water to wash dishes sometimes. And they just say, hey, Dad, we're in a drought. You don't need that much water. And, I think it's those little things. And then taking a bike when you don't have to take a car. But I think we have to realize that. And finally, I just wanted to say before turning the remaining time over to Peter, is that Intuitive Funding is now working with several people in starting a climate change control company as part of our foundation piece. And we are taking this very, very seriously. And we're going to be excited to tell everybody in the future. And we're working with the College of Science on this. And we've got some excellent people that are helping us out. I want to acknowledge Tom Brooks and all his great work in getting this started. And he's written a book on climate change. So if you get a chance to get a copy, it'll be well worth your while. I also want to thank Cassie Slattery and Ann Vivian and Jeff Martin and all the staff. They're just really great to work with. So thank you, everyone. Thank you very much. And Peter, we'll turn the rest of the time over to you.
Well, Tom, I think you did a great job summing things up. I want to echo your words of thanks to our three distinguished panelists. It's always a pleasure to interact in a forum like this with such an exchange of important ideas. And I think, Tom, you nailed it on the head. This is a conversation that we as Utahns are going to be having regularly and for a long time as we confront these issues as a critical part of our future, both economically and really as it impacts our quality of life. So thank you, panelists, again. And of course, Tom, I want to thank you for your role in moderating tonight's panel. So for those of you who are listening, would like to share this recorded presentation, you can find it. It'll take a day or two to produce, but you can find it on the College of Science website or on the College of Science YouTube channel, and you'll be able to share tonight's conversation with others who may not have been able to attend tonight. So thank you, all of you, and good night.